Hello and welcome back, everyone. This video is about a strange and remarkable novella written by the Argentine writer, novelist, Ernesto Sabato. The name of the novella is The Tunnel, El Tunel. And there are already quite a few reviews and discussions of this book on social media, on YouTube. It is recognized as a modern classic. It's very thought-provoking. People love talking about it. It's quite remarkable, but it's one of those books that it lends itself quite well to discussion and to comparison and to comparative analyses. I heard people compare it to some works by Dostoevsky. One person compared it with, at least one person, compared it with that novel Perfume by Patrick Succinct. In this video, in my discussion of the novella, I'm going to touch on three things. First, I want to talk a little bit about what it is that makes this work a psychological novel, a psychological story. Next, I want to really touch on possible misreadings of this work. Misreadings, by that I mean ways of reading it and ways of thinking about it that, in my opinion, miss out what is truly significant about this work. And I'm not going to criticize any of my fellow YouTubers. Instead, I'm going to go for a criticism of the person who wrote the introduction to the Penguin Classics edition of this book. The introduction was written by Colm Tóibín. So I'm going to point to some of the things that I disagree with his introduction, with his kind of overview of the novel. And even though I strongly disagree with him, I'm going to use, I think that those disagreements are useful in opening my own discussion of the book. And then lastly, maybe most interesting, I want to touch on the parallels and connections between two things. One is what is happening inside the world of the novel and what is happening in the world of the author. I think there are really important connections, very meaningful and deep connections and parallels between what the author is doing, the acts of the author as the creator of the work of this novel, and the acts of the character, the main protagonist, within the story. So what is happening within the stories has some relevance, some meaningful connections and parallels to the author. But before that, an overview about the author. Ernesto Sabato was born in 1911 in Rojas, Argentina. He got his PhD in physics, but when he was in his mid-30s, he decided to get out of physics and dedicate himself fully to his creative endeavors, writing and painting. In 1948, he finished this novella, and he was rejected by several editors in Buenos Aires. He found acceptance. He got the story accepted in the France-based magazine called Sur. So Sur was a publication that was founded by an Argentinian editor, but it was operating in France. And the story was read by Albert Camus, among other people. And Camus was the person who commissioned the novel for Gallimard. And among the other well-known people who read and enjoyed and praised the novel were Thomas Mann and Graham Greene. Interesting. And so this the tunnel, the story has been translated into more than 10 languages. And Sabato's other novels include On Heroes and Tombs, 1961, and The Angel of Darkness, 74. And I think those two are quite hard to find compared to this one, which is easier to find. English translation of The Tunnel is done by Margaret Sayers Peden. I hope my pronunciation is at least close. And this edition was published by Penguin Modern Classics in 2011. Okay, so The first thing I promise to talk about, what makes this novel a psychological novel? I mean, almost every novel has a psychological dimension. It's fair to say. There is something psychological about every novel you pick up, every work of fiction. But not every work of fiction is one that people describe as, oh, this is a very psychological novel. What makes a novel psychological is the fact that its psychological dimension is more prominent. It features more prominently the psychological aspects of the story, what's happening. In psychology, psychological sciences, and linguistics, there is this term called the poverty of the stimulus. Bear with me, I have reasons to include this. The poverty of the stimulus was introduced as a term by Noam Chomsky when he was criticizing B.F. Skinner and behaviorism, the behaviorist approach to psychology. And what this means, what this concept is trying to communicate, is that when we are receiving a linguistic message, when we are receiving language, objects of language, just like objects in the physical world, our perception of them is based on something that is not that rich in terms of what is giving us the information, the data that is giving us, the perceptual data, the linguistic data that is coming in, that we are encountering, there's always a poverty in it. There's always an insufficiency in it. What that means is that our mind, the human mind, the human psyche, supplies and constructs based on that poor stimulus the meaning, the coherence, the organization, and the relevance of what we are getting. So the object becomes meaningful. We come to terms with the object, with the words, with sentences, based on our psychic processes of inference and perception that are not necessarily consciously. We don't know what's going on in our mind as we are perceiving something, but there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes. So Noam Chomsky has that term, the poverty of the stimulus, to point that out. In psychology of perception, there are people like Irvin who has a book called Indirect Perception. And in that book, he argues about this constructive mechanisms of perception, that when we perceive an object, it's not just we are directly perceiving it, but we are constructing and inferring. There's an active process of construction going on. Rock also wrote The Logic of Perception. And Irvin Rock is in a kind of, he belongs to a line of thought that began with Hermann von Helmholtz, at least. Goes back at least as far as Helmholtz. There's an opposite, not necessarily opposite, but that line of thought that we construct what we perceive has been opposed and has been in debate with another tradition in psychology of perception, that identifies itself as the direct perception school, represented by James J. Gibson. I don't think Gibson would say that we don't have any inferential processes in our mind, that our mind is not active, that we just passively perceive. But instead, he points out that the richness that we find in the world, the richness of data that we find, it comes from our exchange with the environment. So we don't just receive one portion of input, one snapshot of perceptual data that comes to us, that we meet that image, and then we have to do the rest of the work. Gibson has this concept of the optic flow. There's a flow. There's a what we can think of in terms of a dialogue between us, you, me, the person who is the agent that is perceiving the environment, and the environment. We check our perceptual hypotheses and we test it against what we find in the next moment. That is relevant to, I'm going to now tie it back to the character in this novel, The Tunnel. Our character, our main protagonist, the person who is telling us the story, we get the story from his perspective, Juan Pablo Castel. This character, his contact with reality is not very fluent. He doesn't have that not the optic flow. He's not missing the optic flow, but he's missing the flow of thought, the flow of exchange that we ordinarily need to have realistic ideas and beliefs and perceptions of other people and our situation is like, where our lives are going. His contact with reality is limited. For example, he's a painter, but he doesn't go to art exhibits. He doesn't see the works of other artists. He only goes to exhibits that are showing his own works. He's in general secluded from the rest of society, but he still needs to, just like all of us, he needs to still make sense of the world. He needs to make sense of what is going on around him, what is happening to him. So he ends up thinking too much about situations that he encounters. Rather than going back and forth and dialoguing and exchanging with the world, he overthinks. He's an overthinker. And when he cares about something, he obsesses. He becomes obsessional. He has, in general, a very obsessional character. His overthinking is a consequence of his detachment and his loneliness. So there's a connection between how lonely he is and how much of an overthinker he is. Those two things reinforce each other. The more he overthinks, the lonelier he becomes. And the lonelier he becomes, he doesn't have direct access to how others think, so he has to overthink. But his thought, the way he thinks, there's a logic to them. His thoughts make sense, especially if we consider his form of life, his style of life. His thoughts, his thinking, the way he thinks, his obsessions, the way he is obsessional, it makes sense. The way he approaches situations and other people, and the way he overburdens those situations with his imagination, the way he just imposes his imagination and his own fantasies onto the situations and onto other people, it makes sense, even though it is very unusual. So it is psychological because the psyche of this guy, Juan Pablo Castel, is dominating reality, dominating his relationship with reality. Now, let's now segue to possible misreadings of this work. In the introduction to the Penguin Classics, Colm Tóibín, I really did not like this introduction. The only thing I liked about it was that it was quite short. But as I said, I'm going to use the things that I disagree with as material. So Tóibín writes, I'm quoting him, "In the tunnel, Sabato took the idea of the demented male artist." Demented. Not an appropriate word. Skip ahead a little bit. He created a hero even less heroic than usual and made his actions even more inexplicable to everyone except himself. End quote. That's just not true. To say that his actions are inexplicable means that we cannot make sense of them. We cannot explain them. But we can explain them. We can, if we understand his overthinking tendencies, his obsessional tendencies, and in association to that, his loneliness, the only way in which caring and expression of care is available to him, it makes sense how he thinks and how he acts based on those thoughts. It's not inexplicable. So that claim is just not correct. It's based on a very passing and dismissive view of this central character of the novel. He's not demented. In fact, what is really frightening and what is striking about this story is that this guy's actions make sense to us. He falls in love with a woman. He falls deeply in love. And for several months, he's unable to reach and have any contact because he doesn't know where she is, where she lives, and who she is. He has just met her at one of the exhibits. But he begins to have from the very beginning these idealistic images of her. And as he meets her and gets to know her, we see that he is oscillating between seeing her as pure good, pure goodness, and pure evil, as a deceitful woman who is just making fun of him, being evil, taking advantage of him, laughing behind his back, and then going back to, oh, what an angel. So he's going between the good image and the bad image, and they're both very extreme. And as a consequence, he oscillates, he goes back and forth between loving her and hating her. And his love is very intense, and his hate is as intense. This process of going back and forth, being very idealistic, being very extreme in both directions, is described by psychoanalysts. And I'm going to tell you one person and one place where you can go if you're interested in these kinds of tendencies to read about it. So the term that maybe I can introduce you to is paranoid-schizoid, a paranoid-schizoid position. Now, if that sounds strange, you don't need to learn that term. Just listen to the descriptions of it. And it arises in children, of course, at first, just like most important psychological tendencies. So we read that children who are in paranoid schizoid positions, they oscillate between seeing others as good or bad, or we can say very good or very bad. They inhabit a world, they have a world, the world of a child, that is polarized, good and bad. And children see their world in this exaggerated way, as do adults at times. The objects may not be stable and can switch from good to bad, or the reverse. Skipping to the bottom of the page, this polarization inevitably draws the child's attention to its own capacities for love and hate. The child's own capacities for love and hate. The child will see its own reactions in conflicts within itself. The solution is a splitting of the self. As the child matures, this becomes a splitting off of certain parts of itself that are felt to be bad, and often that means splitting off the capacity to perceive things realistically, especially to see themselves, the child, see themselves realistically. That capacity to see things realistically is something that they don't have. Now, there's another position that potentially comes after the paranoid schizoid, and after some time I'll get to that. This is, by the way, Melanie Klein. I'm not any expert in Kleinian psychoanalysis, which is why I get my information from books like this, The Basics. Melanie Klein, The Basics. This is written by R.D. Hinshelwood and Tomasz Fortuna, published by Routledge. This is The Basics. It's a series of books. Okay, back to the introduction by Colm Tóibín. In the introduction, he also writes that the distance between the subject of the novel and the tone of the prose offers a sort of tension to the narrative. Now, I don't know what that means. Yes, there's a discrepancy between how the novel is written, the language of the novel, and what the language is talking about. And that's because the character from the very beginning is writing for us after the fact. The thing that he's writing about, the whole story has happened in the past, including the murder. He gives us all the information, all the story, basically, all the structure of the narrative is given to us from the very first page, from the very beginning. So there's no spoiler. But I don't know what he means by the tension between those two. If that discrepancy wasn't there, it would be more odd. Because he's writing after the fact, he has to be a little bit calmer. Anyways, Tóibín goes on to say, this tension allows the narrator not to bother with analysis of motive. Not to bother. So it's not a tension, it's a release. How can a tension allow someone to not bother with something? That's what you mean is here, Mr. Tóibín, is a release. Okay. Let's keep writing. So he's not apparently we are not bothering with analysis of motive or flashbacks or character studies. It forces the reader to accept these as either totally unnecessary or fully understood. End quote. That is just totally incorrect. What Sabato does is just subtle. He gives us character analysis. He gives us backstory. He does give us flashback, but he does it in a very minimal and subtle way. I'm going to pick two critical passages for you from chapters 33 and 36. And I'm going to tell you, especially if you have read the novel already, you might remember these. So in chapter 33, very briefly, Castell is thinking about, he's thinking through the situation, and he wants to ask questions from Maria, his love interest. And he wants to be a little bit sneaky in asking his questions. And then he remembers suddenly, out of nowhere, he remembers his mother and how she used to do the same thing to him. So we're reading, quote, "My mother never asked whether we had eaten an apple because we would have denied it. She asked how many apples have you eaten? So if you say 2, you already are admitting that you did eat. So cleverly presenting as fact the question she wanted answered, whether we had eaten the fruit," end quote. So we get a very quick image that she was raised by a mother who didn't communicate with them in a straightforward way. Maybe she didn't communicate with him in a loving way. She wanted to get information and get confession out of them in a way that was mistrustful. She had to be a clever investigator or interrogator with them, with her kids. So he was raised with this mother, and maybe that's relevant to how he became the way he is. He formed these habits of thought as a result. It's possible, right? It's not that character analysis or flashbacks are completely done away with. No. And I'm not like a super careful reader. I'm not a literature professor. So if I can detect these things, so can you. Chapter 36, we read, "Then again, it was a river pulling us back like a dream to our childhood. And I saw Maria galloping her horse wildly, her hair streaming in the wind, her eyes hallucinated. And I saw myself in my small town in the south, in my sick room, with my face pressed to the window glass, watching the snow, my eyes too hallucinated," end quote. I would change the word. I don't know about the original Spanish, but I suspect it would be better, in my view, to switch hallucinated with in reverie. So Maria's eyes were in reverie as she was riding the horse, and as he was pressing his face against the window in his sick room, watching the snow, his eyes were also in reverie. I don't know. Also in chapter 36, we read that he's now he's changing his judgments. He's now convinced that, quote, "that the whole story of the passageways was my own ridiculous invention, and that after all, there was only one tunnel, dark and solitary, mine, the tunnel in which I had spent my childhood, my youth, my entire life," end quote. So this is one place where he is giving us a glimpse into his solitary childhood, that he was a lonely child. He was a lonely child. But what is happening here towards the end, in the last few chapters of the novel, is he is getting from, we could say, he's getting out of the paranoid-schizoid position into what Klein describes as a depressive position. The depressive position is when you accept the reality of the complex situation and you move away from your idealism into a more realistic perception. And when you, instead of oscillating between very negative and very positive, pure good and pure evil, now maybe you settle on the fact that the person that you love has both qualities. That's the depressive position. And I think this novella walks us through that process of how the character and maybe Sabato are getting from schizoid paranoid to the depressive position. I don't know. You can make that case, I think. So we can, as some of the commentators have said, he is giving us here, Ernesto Sabato, as a detailed, realistic character portrait. It's a very character-driven story. Maybe that's even better than to say that it is psychological. In the beginning of the novel, our character meets someone. That one person becomes extremely special, becomes the center of his world, but in a way that is not faithful to the realities of the woman, but instead it is more faithful to his own fantasies, and he wants her to serve his imagination and to kind of confirm his ideas and his fantasies. He wants her to kind of to be assimilated into his best case scenario fantasy. And so one person becomes extremely significant, extremely special, and everything, because of that specialness, everything has to be examined under the microscope of his mind. And he wants to determine which one of these extreme possibilities are the real thing. Is he going to be extremely happy from now on, or is he going to be extremely miserable? Page 36, towards the end, gives us, I think, the most beautiful part of the book, which to me is giving us a kind of poetics of loneliness, what it means for this singular character, this very particular, unique character of Castell, to be lonely. What is the meaning of his loneliness? So if you're just driven by the story, if you're following the plot until that point, you get to see a really moving portrayal of what his life is and what it means to him from his own perspective. As I said, there are also very brief quotes about his past, about his childhood, about his tricky mother and his sick room. Okay, the last thing I wanted to touch on is parallels to the task of the novelist. So there's a peculiar way in which the relationship between Castell and Maria, Juan Pablo and Maria, begins. That relationship. Their relationship begins through one of the paintings of Juan Pablo Castell. He sees her coming to the exhibit and looking at one of his paintings, one of his artworks, but she pays attention to a part of his work that is neglected by everybody else. In one of his paintings, there's a scene, one scene that is part of a bigger painting. And that scene is scene of a woman by the window waiting. And what we read in the story is that similar to that woman in the painting, Maria is also occupying a kind of position similar to that. So similar to the woman in the painting by the window, Maria is also in her own way waiting by the window. Maria has the desire to have maybe more control over her own life, to love and be loved. She goes away from her home regularly, stays at the rural estate, the estancia, with her husband's cousin. And she insists on using her maiden name, even though she's married. She occasionally has these affairs, but the affairs are not fulfilling, and she keeps getting disappointed by these lovers. She doesn't have much space in her actual life. In the novel, she also doesn't get much space. Just like how that part in the painting in the novel, that scene doesn't have much space in the painting. So it is impressive for that reason for someone to notice it, to notice that part of the painting. So the small part of the work is the true contact point to something that is real, that deserves our attention. And that, in the case of the novel, is Maria. what is striking about Maria, what is significant about her, is how much she is not portrayed in the story. How much her presence and what we get from her, how much everything that we see from her is filtered through the distorted imagination, the distorted mind of Juan Pablo. I mean, distorted, but it has its own logic. It's not chaotic. It's systematically distorting Maria's presence in the story. So the hidden side of the story is Maria, and that hidden side of the story eventually gets killed. It gets killed, and by killing her, Juan Pablo's imagination becomes hegemonic. It becomes completely dominant. So my speculation here is this, that Ernesto Sabato is expressing something very deep here about the nature of the creative activity, the nature of creating a work of art. Creating a work of art, according to this view, involves decisiveness, a kind of decisiveness that is almost involves cruelty. You have to be cruel to be creative, to pick the one thing or one way of looking, one aspect of what you're looking at or what you're expressing, one line of exploration, and eliminate other competing ways of expressing that same thing, that same situation. So in this case, the fact that after killing Maria, Juan Pablo is sitting down to create this literary work that reflects what he has been through and what they had both been through. By doing that, he is establishing his perspective and his way of looking at things as the only dominant, hegemonic way, and killing Maria in that one extra step by letting her remain in our consciousness through the filter of his mind. And that's basically what Sabato does. Any novelist does this when they sit down and write a novel. Okay, let me know what you think about that final speculation. To me, this is the most exciting part of what it means to reflect on the tunnel, the parallels between the task of the novelist and the life of the character within the novel. There are also a couple of interesting tangents, and maybe I'll end with these. There's a treatment of psychoanalysis and its legitimacy. The Sabato touches on this, or Juan Pablo touches on this. The fact that psychoanalysts are always insecure and they always want to say that our association is the one that is internationally recognized. It's the legitimate organization and it's the right one. And those other guys are not real psychoanalysts. They're not the real followers of Freud and so on and so forth. And it's funny because I read this book wanting to take a break from psychoanalysis, from reading Freud and works like this, but it ended up being more relevant than I had expected. So there is a line of thought about psychoanalysis, and the book itself, the story, is quite psychoanalytically relevant, I would say. Another tangent is Hunter's theory. The Hunter, one of the characters in the novella, gives us briefly his theory about detective novels and how detective novels in our time are the contemporary form of the picaresque, the inspiration behind Don Quixote. And Hunter, after giving us that idea, he proposes a possible plot about a detective who finds out at the end that he is the criminal that he is looking for. This is just amazing, and it reinforces my suspicion, my speculative idea that Sabato is communicating something here about something very deep about the nature of creating a work of fiction, and how this work is a reflection of what he himself is going through. A symbolic, metaphorical way of expressing it, but it is related. It is related. Anyways, I hope you found this discussion interesting, despite having a few other reviews of this novel. But I think people who are interested in my videos and in my channel, and there are not many of you, I think you I thought that you would enjoy listening to my reflections, combining psychology, psychoanalysis with the reading of this novella. If you have read it, let me know what you think. The Tunnel. If you haven't, it is, I would say, if you like the stuff that I discuss on this channel, you would enjoy it. Okay, take care of yourselves. Till next time.